Hello, 326. This is Tim Richards, and I'm going to talk a little bit about Bootstrap, a very brief introduction to Bootstrap, to give you an idea on how it's put together and enough information to be able to follow along in the workshop, which contains most of the reading and the material for which you will be exploring how to design and implement a user interface using the Bootstrap framework. There are three important parts of a web application, at least in the browser part of a web application. There is HTML, hypertext markup language, which is used to define the structure of a user interface. That is where certain parts of that user interface exist, what they should contain, such as nav bars, editors, buttons, forms, so on and so forth. So it defines that structure. CSS, cascading style sheets, is that part of the web application front end that defines the styling and placement of the structured components in your HTML. So it talks about things or defines colors, fonts, spacing, as well as location of the structure or components inside HTML. And JavaScript is the third part, which defines the behavior. And that allows us to do things like click a button and have something happen. So if you're starting with a blank slate, you need to decide where you're going to put things in a user interface, right? So where the buttons go, where does the text go? You certainly need HTML for content and the structure of that content. You need CSS for styling, and like I said, you need JavaScript for behavior. You might then add a background color, and you most certainly would do this using CSS, but you can also accomplish this using JavaScript. But as we'll see as part of constructing the user interface, it'll be all about adding cascading style sheet rules and in particular using the so-called Bootstrap framework. You might decide that you need a navigation bar as part of your user interface. Obviously, this is the mock interface used by the workshops for defining the Facebook application. So we might have a navigation bar, then possibly another sidebar with additional controls, right? So this is your classic Facebook application. You have friends and favorites and groups, and you can click on items in the list under each of those categories. You might have a main content area. So here, this is the feed in your Facebook application, and many applications these days on the web often have a feed area. So if you just take a moment to think about some of these applications, whether it be Google's inbox or Twitter or Instagram, Facebook, right? All of these applications have a feed, so it's a very common feature. Essentially, a feed just breaks down into a component that's scrollable, right? And so like the feed in Facebook, you can scroll to see past posts. You might have another application where you scroll through subjects or tags for emails. So it's a very common component in web applications. And then you might have another sidebar, this one on the right, for advertisements, of course, because that's always important if we're trying to make money off of the web app that we're building. Everyone needs a friend, right? So here in the Facebook application, we have another component, the chat component, which is, as you can see, a little bit different because it sits on top or in front of another existing component, that right sidebar. So there are other things that we need to do in order to make that happen. We could move things around, right? So this is one way of defining the layout of our user interface. We could certainly flip things around where now we have the nav bar on the bottom and we have our chat box and advertisements on the left, followed by what used to be our left sidebar containing the different categories and links to items under those categories. And here our feed is all the way to the right. So this might make sense for some applications and different for others. So as part of constructing a uh, usable interface for an application, it's important to think about how the user of your app will be interacting with the application and what makes most sense visually, aesthetically, as well as functionally. You could switch it around again. So here now we have our feed on the left, our nav bar is back on the top, followed by the chat and the advertisements, and then what used to be our left nav bar with the categories. So what we're looking at for building at least a mock of our user interface, a skeleton of our user interface, we're mostly going to be concerning ourselves with HTML and CSS, at least from the perspective of how we're using Bootstrap. Bootstrap, this framework that we'll talk about momentarily, does have JavaScript under the hood that does a bit of work, but what you see as a user of Bootstrap is primarily HTML and CSS. Obviously, we don't want to reinvent the wheel, right? Most sites have a common format and similar UI components, right? I just talked about the feed component, very common component. Lots of applications use it. Nav bars are all over the place. Uh, Lots of applications use them. They're really important. We could start from scratch, but in reality, that's not how it's done. If we were concerning ourselves with how to build a UI framework, that would be a different objective. But the objective that we have is not to be building UI frameworks. The objective here is to build an entire web application. And in order to do that effectively and construct something that is visually appealing and functional and also exposes you to modern frameworks, modern UIs and modern apps, we're looking at using a framework. So we've talked about HTML and CSS in other documents, as well as the workshop that covers this material. And so we can understand the basics of how to use them. They're relatively straightforward, and it's something that you can explore and figure out quite quickly. But what we really want to do is use a framework to do most of the heavy lifting. And that involves a lot of customizations on colors and buttons and typography and icons so that it makes the UI experience better for our user. And also allows us to build these applications much faster. So Bootstrap is one of these popular HTML, CSS, and JavaScript frameworks for building responsive mobile-first projects on the web. At least that's how they define it. So a lot of what Bootstrap is about is that they put in a lot of work under the hood to identify the devices that the application is running on, the browser it's using, and try and present to the user a consistent and uniform interface, along with styling that you can adjust so that it makes it more specific to the particular application. A little bit about Bootstrap's history. Originally, it was called Twitter Blueprint, and it was developed by Mark Otto and Jacob Thornton at Twitter. And the problem that they were running into at Twitter was the consistency across their applications and across developers. So everyone was building their own CSS and HTML components, but they all had slightly different appearances or completely different appearances. So they were looking at trying to develop a framework to promote consistency across all applications, right? And this isn't too surprising. One notable example is the Mac OS environment where Apple uh, tries to enforce a uniform and consistent user experience. So this is, to a certain degree, a similar approach where if everyone's using Bootstrap, your UIs will look consistent and the same. And this is good from a user perspective because using one application versus another, you become accustomed to how the buttons work, how the scroll bars work, so on and so forth. They created this at Hack Week, which is a internal Twitter hackathon, um, and eventually renamed it to Twitter Bootstrap. It was released on August 19th, 2011, and since then it's become increasingly popular as a CSS and HTML framework on the web. In fact, about 10% or 11% of all websites on the web use Twitter Bootstrap. Some of the features include, like I've already mentioned, cross-browser compatibility. This is really important. Browsers are made differently, perhaps not as different as they used to be, but there are still some differences, and so Bootstrap handles that for us. Grid scaffolding for design. So this is useful. They define a grid layout for the browser view so that you can design where your components exist, where your UI components exist within that grid. So if you think of a piece of graph paper and being able to draw your components in terms of rows and columns on that graph paper, it makes it easier to talk about where things should be, as well as sizes and shapes. They support multi-screen for responsive design, and responsive design meaning if you resize the browser window, the Bootstrap framework will modify the components so that it's appealing to the user. If it's displayed inside of a phone versus a browser on the desktop, it will display those in a way that's useful for that dimension, the screen dimension. And they come from a mobile first mentality, which most of these frameworks do, because they assume that you're going to be viewing these applications not just in a browser on the desktop, but also from your phone. And ultimately, it's a great UI framework to work with. It's relatively straightforward and provides a lot of support for a variety of different user interface components that you see in most applications. So the main concepts of Bootstrap are a 12-column grid layout. So like I had said before, this piece of graph paper that we're laying out all of our components. The graph paper used by Bootstrap consists of 12 columns. And from those 12 columns, we can divide them into parts called rows. Each row can consist of a defined column layout, so we can talk about how big the column, how wide the column should be. Should it be 1 column wide, 2 columns wide, 3 columns wide? Do we divide it into to 2 parts, 3 parts? We can have multiple rows. Okay, so they're essentially providing the facility for laying out your user interface components in a grid. They provide lots of different UI components. Glyph icons, for example, you see a glyph icon on the right over here, right? So they have lots and lots of these glyph icons, and there's a link from the workshop that starts off with Bootstrap showing all the different glyph icons they provide. And as you'll notice lots of them, and the Facebook clone that we build will use a bunch of these glyph icons. They support drop-down boxes and a variety of different buttons, both in size, color, and shape. Input boxes, so the ability for you to type in information into the user interface. Navs, which are within nav bars. Okay, so you have the typical nav bar UI component. Within there you have different nav buttons. Breadcrumbs are supported, which you don't see them as much anymore, but it allows you to track from pages that you've been to or menu items that you are drilling into, labels and thumbnails, and so on and so forth. There are lots of components for you to use. We only talk about some of them as part of the Facebook clone, but give you pointers to the documentation for Bootstrap on where to find additional components, and your team should go and read up on these and decide what components are the best components to use for the application that you're developing. So this is what the 12-column grid layout system looks like, relatively straightforward. As you can see, it is split up into 12 columns, right? 1, 2, 3, all the way up to 12, right? The columns are running from top to bottom. And then within those columns, we can define rows. So we might have a row which is going to span all 12 columns, right? That's what this one does. Okay, it's spanning all of the 12 columns. We might have a row where we want to divide the user interface into a column of 6 subcolumns and another column of 6 subcolumns. You can see it's divided right here. Or we might have a user interface where we want to divide it up into 4, right? So we have components that are 4 columns each, and we have 3 of them to fill in the 12 columns. Or we can decompose it even further, right, where we have components that are 2 columns wide. So you can imagine a variety of different user interface components fitting into these, right? So here we might have a nav bar, okay, which would span all 12. We saw that with the Facebook clone. Here we could have maybe 2 columns containing different feeds. Here we might have a left sidebar over here and a right sidebar, and then maybe this is our feed, or whatever else, whatever other type of user interface component. Maybe it's a text editor. And perhaps the columns that are separated by or divided by 2s, okay, maybe that allows us to display thumbnails and images. Perhaps you're building a photo application. Or they don't have to divide evenly. So here we're dividing the 12 columns up by 4 and by 8, right? So here is possibly some sidebar that has additional UI components. And then on this side, we might have some main feed part of the application. How might we lay out Facebook? Of course, there's lots of different ways, right? We might have a main navigation bar, nav bar component in Bootstrap, which spans all 12 columns. Here we might have a left sidebar, maybe that spans 2 or 3 columns. The right sidebar spanning 4 columns. And then perhaps we have the main feed, which consists of 5 Bootstrap columns. Our chat window turns out to be custom, and as you'll see when implementing the mock user interface for Facebook in the latest workshop, you'll see that the chat window requires some specialization to exist outside of the 12-column layout for Bootstrap. And so you'll notice that you can do most of what you want in the context of the 12-column layout, but sometimes you're required to build something a little bit more custom. Or you might decide to not have it custom and then have it conform to the grid layout. So in the Facebook application, the chat window kind of floats above the other windows, the other components. We might decide that we don't want it to float. We designate a particular area specific for the chat window. It all depends on the design and how difficult it is to implement. We can also subdivide each column into rows of 12 columns each, if that makes sense for the application, right? So you can, it's rather flexible in that you can have within a particular column, subdivide that into 12 columns, right? So this is a nested structure. It just depends on what you're trying to accomplish, right? So here we've further subdivided uh, the user interface into more fine-grained components, right? So here we've taken, say, this left nav bar, which we defined as being 3 columns wide, and then inside it subdivided that into actual 3 columns and 2 rows, right? So now we have 2 rows and 3 columns each. Likewise over here, we had divided this into 4 columns. Okay, so it spanned 4 columns. But in here we have row 1 of 4 columns and row 2 of 4 columns. Okay, so there's lots of flexibility. How's it done? So the way Bootstrap works is that it defines CSS classes that specify the width and size and shape and color of your columns. So here you notice we have .col-md-1. That defines a column of size 1, and MD is medium, but what that is really referring to is that it's primarily designed for desktop applications. There's another CSS class that uses, instead of MD, it uses XS. So if you were designing an application that is primarily intended for a phone or mobile device with a small viewport, then XS would be used. Okay. For the most part, we're going to be sticking with MD. So here, column-MD-8 is a column that spans 8 columns, Bootstrap columns wide, and .col-MD-4 spans 4 Bootstrap columns wide. Again, these are both CSS classes. Here again, we split it up into 4, all CSS classes, and we'll see some examples momentarily. And here we divide it up into 6 and 6. So this is what it looks like, combining the HTML and Bootstrap with its classes. So in Bootstrap, we could use a div element, and if you recall from the material on HTML, as well as the material covered in the workshop, a div is a generic HTML tag or element, and the class attribute used as part of an HTML element allows us to define classes that the HTML element is associated with, and those classes are defined in cascading style sheets. So there's a style sheet rule called row, and as you can imagine, a row defines a row of columns, okay? And then here we're using divs and class of column-md-1 to split up this row into 12 columns, right? 1, 2, all the way up to 12. Here we have another row that we're splitting it up 8 and 4. Another row, 4, 4, 4, and another row, 6, 6. So as you can see, it's relatively straightforward. With a little bit of HTML, and including the Bootstrap library, which the workshop discusses on how it's included, we can use these CSS classes to define the structure of our user interface. So here's an example. JS Fiddle, there are 2 ways of experimenting with a lot of this stuff, JS Fiddle and JS Spin. We'll see both of them. But here's JS Fiddle. If we click on that link, brings up this example right here, right? Or a similar example where we are defining a div with class called container. It turns out in Bootstrap, this is the topmost HTML element that defines where all of our UI elements will exist in. Here we define a Bootstrap row, okay? And then we divide that row up into 3 columns. One that's 3 wide, one that's 7 wide, and one that's 2 wide. Okay. Here we have another row, divided up 4, 4, and 4. Another row, 4, 4, and 4. Okay, as you notice here we have MD, which is medium devices. Okay. Also using MD as large devices as well. SM, which is used for smaller devices, those that are greater than or equal to 768 pixels wide. Otherwise, Bootstrap will collapse them. As you can see here, this is collapsed in a particular way. We'll actually see. We'll get to that in a moment. XS is extra small devices, less than 768 pixels wide. So we're talking about a phone. Okay, so if you can see, when we expand this out or resize this window, you can see how Bootstrap is moving these elements around to adjust them so that they fit to a certain degree better in the viewing area, right? So that's what your UI will do using Bootstrap. You won't have to worry about when you move things around, when you resize stuff, resize the browser, it's going to do the job of reconfiguring your user interface, which is really convenient. Okay. There are lots of examples. I'm going to just talk about a few of them just to give you an idea. This is using JSBin. Okay, so a slightly different interface. All right, so here it's showing some more examples. Here's some custom CSS that is simply being used to define the background color and the padding between these different examples. Over here, most of the stuff you don't need, let's close the CSS part. Most of this you don't need to concern yourself with except to just include it. And the workshop talks about how to include it as part of the workshop. But this is all stuff that defines the Bootstrap support. Then over here, once again, you have the container, which is where all your UI elements or components are contained. We have a row. Okay. This is using the XS column class, call-XS-12, extra small devices. And here we have this demo content. If you look here, right, that's a class that has been customly defined. It's not Bootstrap. And then we here have this column XS12, right? So it's defining a column of 12 smaller Bootstrap columns. Here we're doing the same thing again, right? And we're just using our custom classes here to change the color, right? This is a Bootstrap class. So it's important. You'll recognize a lot of these Bootstrap classes have this sort of format, but it's pretty easy to see. We can show another example here of this 2-column layout. Right here we're defining columns of equal size 6 and 6 for this row, right? 6 and 6. Here we have divs of 4 and 8, column -XS-4 and 8, right? So we have these different size columns. And then here we have an example of 3 and 9, right down here. And if we were to bring this out, you can see right here that these have expanded out properly. And if we adjust the window, Bootstrap is going to adjust these properly and scale them to the right size. Rather convenient. Bootstrap has headings and typography, so it will define really nice headings of certain size and shape, okay, with a particular font that of course you can change. But this is how all the headings come out. This is your HTML heading tags, 1 through 6, right? So this is how they're displayed. There's secondary, which I won't talk about. You can look at on your own. Here's an example on how to define rows inside using Bootstrap. So Bootstrap has a class called table that you can use as part of the table tag. And then you can include all the structure for a particular table. So here's the body, which contains the actual table row data. Here's a table row, and here are all the table data, which are the individual columns. You can also have a table head, right, which defines the headings of each of the columns. Okay, and this is how Bootstrap will display that. Right, so this is really useful if your application actually is displaying a list of data in a table-like format. Right, they provide this really nicely styled table that adjusts when you resize it. And I'll just jump over here to nabs. Here's an example of showing lots of different things available as part of the Bootstrap framework. Right, so here you see glyph icons, which are very common icons that you see in other applications. Quite nice, very sharp. Input boxes, okay, that you can type things into. Obviously don't do anything right now, right? And clicking on that actually causes it to die because there's no behavior associated with it. And the default behavior is to actually try and send something to a server, which we're not doing. Here are some search buttons, okay? So here's some examples. I mean, obviously here it resizes, and here's some tabs, right? So let's see, if we jump over here, we have at the very top these buttons search and search, two different styles, right? So we define a form. And a form allows us to put in buttons that have certain behaviors, although we won't necessarily be using the form tag in the Facebook app. Then we define a button, right? So there's a button tag that defines a button. We give it a type called submit. We talk more about that in the workshop, not important to talk about now. With respect to Bootstrap, we give it these Bootstrap classes. One is BTN for button. The other one is BTN default. And then BTN primary, which gives these two different search buttons rather, different styling, right? So here it's blue background, here there's no background. This is what these classes do, and you can look up in the Bootstrap documentation, and it will show examples of what these things do and how they look, and of course you can combine them. Here we have another class that's part of a span. If you remember, span is like a div, but rather than have it be on its own row, it's inline. Okay, but it's just generic. We're using two classes, glyph icon and glyph icon search. So first we're using this class glyph icon to mention that we'd like to display a glyph icon, and then glyph icon search, which is going to give us this magnifying glass, right? And we put that all in a span, right? This span actually represents the displaying of the icon. So all you need to know is that when you want to display an icon like a glyph icon, you define that glyph icon by using a span tag class followed by as part of that class glyph icon, and then the actual glyph icon. In this case, it's defined as glyph icon dash search, and then that's what will be displayed right before the text called search. If we used a div here, in fact, I'm going to try it. I'm not sure what will happen. It still is okay with it, but you really want to be using a span. So as you can see, as part of these JSBin and JSFiddle, you can make changes over here, and it redisplays it over here, which is really useful for playing around with your user interface and using some of the Bootstrap UI components. Here's tabs with icons. So again, what you'll notice is when you go to the Bootstrap documentation, it's going to show you how to do all these things. Right? It's going to give you examples. So for providing tabs with icons, right, for different parts of your tabbed UI, you use the class nav and nav tabs as part of a UL, or unordered list element, HTML element. Then you have a list item whose class is active, right? So here you can see that this is active, right? It's the one that you're currently viewing. And then here we have a link defined on a glyph icon, right? So this is the glyph icon for home and then the actual text home. And we've defined that as a clickable link. So right now these don't do anything, but when we start talking about React and JavaScript, ideally we'll click on this and it's going to cause it to change the profile to being active. Pills nav with icons, right? So here, these are called pills, right? These are sort of a similar idea to the tabs, but it allows you to click on each one of them. Very similar structure, nav pills instead of nav tabs. And then we have this button example. I won't talk about button group here because the workshop goes into it in detail and you can easily read the documentation, but essentially it groups several buttons and handles spacing between them. Okay, and much of this is mostly the same. One interesting thing is the drop down, right? Document, edit, share, and print and delete. Something that you might include if you are providing some level of support for editing text, perhaps. Here, it's an unordered list. The class is drop-down menu, which defines this drop-down menu component. And then each list item is a link. And then here, of course, we include the glyph icons as well. Edit, share, and print. That's what we do here. So what you should do with this is you should take a look at these this code, the links. They're part of the weekly syllabus. And you should play around with these examples. It's the best way to get to learn how to use React. Bootstrap. Here's another example. I'm not going to go through it now, but you can see how a nav bar is put together. Relatively straightforward. You do it on the workshop anyways, but it's another example. So spend 10 to 15 minutes on these examples, and it'll really help solidify what you're doing, because to really understand how to use Bootstrap, you need to experience it, which is why as part of Workshop 3, we're leading you through the creation of a Facebook UI using Bootstrap. But as part of that workshop, there's a lot of documentation, including as part of the workshop that's reading, that gives you links to the material that will help you along in understanding how everything is put together.